Story 1. The Sand Currency Hoax of Ancient Sardinia. We begin with the unusual tale of sand as money, a story part history, part crime, and part mystery. In the early centuries of Mediterranean trade, when merchants sought stable means of exchange, commodities like salt, grain, and even seashells were used as currency. But in the rugged and isolated island of Sardinia, an unusual crime story emerged. You might imagine a place where the shorelines glitter with endless sand, grains so abundant they seem worthless. Yet for a brief and almost unbelievable chapter in trade history, unscrupulous merchants tricked unsuspecting traders by packaging sand, yes, ordinary sand, as if it were a valuable currency. The records of this hoax are obscure, pieced together from fragments of trade logs, letters between merchants, and the puzzled commentary of historians who still argue whether it was greed, desperation, or sheer audacity that drove this scheme. When we left off, the idea was almost absurd, that something as worthless as sand could be passed off as a form of currency. But in the world of trade, perception often outweighs reality. If a group of people agree to treat a substance as valuable, whether salt, seashells, or even paper, it gains the aura of legitimacy. And for a time, the Sardinian sand hoaxers used this very principle to their advantage. The mechanics of the deception. The scheme began not on the beaches, but in the warehouses. Sardinian merchants filled sacks with carefully selected sand. This wasn't ordinary shore sand, coarse and mixed with seaweed or shells. Instead, they sourced from riverbanks and inland dunes, where the grains were uniform, fine, and pale enough to resemble powdered minerals. The sacks were then sealed with wax and stamped with forged seals that mimicked those of reputable trade guilds. To the untrained eye, they appeared to contain alum, saltpeter, or even rare volcanic dust materials prized for tanning leather, preserving food, or producing glass. Merchants from Genoa, Pisa, and even North Africa, accustomed to long journeys and often trusting the seals more than their own eyes, would purchase these sacks. Many only discovered the ruse weeks later, when the valuable powder dissolved into nothing but sand. By then, the sellers had long vanished into Sardinia's rugged hills. The social conditions that made it possible. To understand why this hoax could work at all, you need to picture Sardinia in the medieval and early Renaissance periods. The island was remote, sparsely populated outside of coastal towns, and fractured by competing rulers. Pirates prowled the seas, bandits roamed the mountains, and official oversight was weak at best. Trust in trade was fragile. A sealed sack was both a promise and a gamble. Merchants often bought goods based on reputation, or on the pressure of making quick deals before storms forced them back to sea. Fraud flourished in these gray zones, where scrutiny was lax and desperation ran high. It was here that the sand fraudsters thrived. They weren't simple thieves. Many had once been legitimate traders, driven into deceit by debt or political upheaval. For them, the fraud was less about greed than survival in an unforgiving system. Early investigations and suspicion. Word of the deception spread quickly. Letters from outraged traders described the humiliation of unloading worthless goods in foreign markets. In one account preserved in a Genoese archive, a merchant named Matteo di Rossi complained that a shipment he purchased in Cagliari turned to dust before my eyes, ruining his reputation with his partners in Tunis. But catching the culprits was another matter entirely. Sardinia's rugged geography provided natural cover. Villages often protected their own against outsiders, especially foreign investigators. And in a time before organized police forces, justice relied on private reprisals or the limited authority of local lords. Suspicion fell on several merchant families in Oristano and Alghero, whose sudden bursts of wealth, lavish homes, fine clothing, and imported wines could not be explained by legitimate trade. Yet every attempt to bring them to court collapsed under conflicting testimony and the absence of hard evidence. The ripple effects in Mediterranean trade. The sand hoax may seem minor compared to grander frauds in history, but its impact was significant. Loss of trust. Traders grew wary of Sardinian goods in general, even legitimate ones. Salt from Cagliari, once a staple export, suffered a sharp decline in demand. Guild reforms. Merchant guilds in Genoa and Venice began requiring more stringent inspections of sealed goods. For the first time, inspectors were stationed at ports to puncture sacks and verify their contents before sale. Violence and retaliation. Some traders, ruined by the fraud, took matters into their own hands. A Venetian captain reportedly burned 2 Sardinian warehouses suspected of housing fraudulent goods. In this way, a relatively small crime rippled outward, shaping the very systems designed to protect against it. A deeper question emerges. Yet behind the mechanics of the fraud, one mystery lingers. Was it truly just an isolated scam run by desperate merchants, or was there something more organized at play? Some historians argue that the sand scheme was not the work of a few rogue traders, but a coordinated effort, perhaps even sanctioned by local rulers who saw it as a way to undermine rival powers. After all, if Sardinia was marginalized in broader Mediterranean trade, why not strike back by sowing chaos? Others suggest it was linked to smuggling networks that used sand sacks as cover for transporting contraband saltpeter for gunpowder, or even stolen coins hidden beneath layers of worthless dust. The tension before collapse. By the mid-15th century, the fraud had become so notorious that Sardinian trade itself was on the verge of collapse. Merchants could no longer rely on reputation, and buyers began demanding direct inspection, even if it delayed voyages. The fraudsters, pressed by suspicion and increasingly violent retaliation, grew bolder. Reports describe shipments of sand being mixed with trace amounts of valuable minerals to pass casual inspection. Others turned to intimidation, threatening inspectors with violence. It was only a matter of time before the scheme unraveled completely. And so, we reach the critical moment. What happened when the fraudsters finally pushed too far, when the sacks they sold ended up in the wrong hands, sparking an investigation that would expose the full scale of the Sardinian sand hoax? When the Sardinian sand hoax reached its peak, the deception was no longer a local embarrassment. It had begun to destabilize confidence in trade across the Mediterranean. Fraud had always existed, of course, but the brazenness of substituting sand for valuable minerals or salts made merchants feel mocked, even humiliated. The sense of betrayal demanded retribution, and it was this pressure that set in motion the events that finally exposed the perpetrators. The shipment that changed everything. The turning point came with a Venetian convoy in the late 15th century. Among its cargo were dozens of sacks purchased in Cagliari under the guarantee that they contained alum, a mineral essential for the booming textile industry. Alum fixed dyes into cloth, and without it, Venetian fabrics lost both color and value. When the sacks were opened in Venice's Fondaco dei Tedeschi, a trading house that handled goods from across Europe, the truth was undeniable. The alum was nothing more than pale Sardinian sand. This was no minor loss. The Venetian state had invested heavily in securing alum supplies, and the fraud threatened not just one merchant's profits but the Republic's economic stability. The Doge himself ordered an inquiry. Unlike the scattered complaints of private traders, this investigation carried the full weight of Venetian power. The hunt for the fraudsters. Venetian envoys were dispatched to Sardinia under armed escort. Their mission was to uncover who had supplied the fraudulent goods and ensure swift punishment. Local lords, eager to avoid Venetian wrath, cooperated at least on the surface. Records show that inspectors searched warehouses in Cagliari and Oristano, unsealing hundreds of sacks. Many proved genuine, but enough contained sand to confirm the widespread nature of the fraud. Suspicion quickly fell on a network of merchants connected to one prominent family in Oristano. Their sudden wealth, combined with testimony from dockworkers who claimed to have filled sacks with sand under orders, made them prime suspects. But the investigation faced obstacles. Witnesses recanted under pressure. Officials dragged their feet. Some envoys reported being followed at night, their lodgings threatened by fire. Sardinia's fractured politics meant that exposing one family risked implicating others who provided protection or perhaps even participated in the scheme. Trials and punishments. Despite the resistance, Venetian investigators eventually presented enough evidence to stage a trial. Several Sardinian merchants were charged with fraud and conspiracy. The punishments were harsh: confiscation of property, exile, and in at least 2 cases, execution by hanging. These sentences were intended less as justice than as a warning, an example to discourage others from attempting similar deceptions. But the trial records also reveal something murkier. Some suspects escaped before sentencing, vanishing into the interior mountains. Others were acquitted on thin evidence, suggesting powerful allies shielded them. The sense that only a portion of the truth had come to light lingered in the minds of contemporaries. The collapse of the scheme. The executions marked the beginning of the end for the sand currency hoax. Heightened inspections. Merchant guilds established standardized protocols for testing goods. Inspectors punctured sacks, tasted samples, and even employed primitive chemical tests to distinguish minerals from sand. Reputation overhaul. Sardinian goods suffered reputational damage for decades. Traders demanded steep discounts or avoided the island altogether, which crippled legitimate commerce. Withdrawal of protection. Local lords, once willing to shield fraudulent merchants, withdrew their support when Venetian power proved overwhelming. Without protection, the fraudsters found themselves isolated. By the early 16th century, the scheme had effectively collapsed. Sardinian trade continued, but never again with the same level of trust it once enjoyed. Long-term consequences. Though the fraud itself faded, its consequences endured in ways few could have predicted. Institutional trust. The episode reinforced the necessity of institutional oversight in trade. Merchant guilds expanded their powers, paving the way for modern trade regulations. Economic ripples. The damage to Sardinia's reputation meant that other Mediterranean regions like Sicily and mainland Italy gained market share at its expense. Psychological impact. The case became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most mundane material sand could be weaponized through deception. For historians, it serves as a vivid example of how fraud not only harms individuals, but reshapes entire systems. The mystery that remains. And yet, one question still lingers. Was the Sardinian sand hoax merely a desperate scam, or something more deliberate? Some modern scholars point to documents suggesting the fraud was tolerated, or even quietly encouraged by certain rulers. By destabilizing Venetian or Genoese traders, Sardinian elites may have hoped to negotiate better terms for their own exports. Others argue it was part of a larger smuggling enterprise. After all, what better cover to move contraband than to hide it in sacks no one expected to open? Sand may have been the surface-level fraud, while the deeper crime remained concealed. We may never know the full extent of the scheme. What survives is a fragmentary record, letters of complaint, trial transcripts, scattered references in merchant ledgers. Yet the very fact that it lingers in historical memory, centuries later, speaks to its impact. Closing reflection. As you think about this strange episode, picture it. A Venetian inspector cutting open a sack, expecting the powder that would fix dyes into crimson velvet, and instead watching grains of sand trickle through his fingers. In that moment, centuries of trust in seals, stamps, and reputation cracked open like the sack itself. Fraud, after all, is not only about theft, it's about trust betrayed. And in Sardinia's sand hoax, we see how fragile trust can be and how a crime, however small in its material gain, can echo across continents and centuries. If sand could once be passed off as money, what other deceptions then and now do we accept without question, simply because everyone else does? Story 2. The disappearance of the Somerton Man. It begins on a quiet stretch of beach in Adelaide, South Australia. The date is December 1, 1948. Dawn has just begun to wash the horizon when two men, out for an early morning walk, notice something unusual on the sand near Somerton Beach. There, slumped against the seawall, lies the body of a man. He is well dressed in a suit and polished shoes, his legs extended neatly in front of him, his arms resting by his side. To a casual passerby, he might have looked as though he had simply drifted off to sleep. But as the men approached, they realized he was not asleep. He was dead. This discovery would ignite one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history, a case that has baffled investigators, inspired speculation, and resisted resolution for over 7 decades. The Somerton Man, as he came to be known, was a stranger in every sense. No identification, no luggage, and no clear cause of death. Only fragments of clues, scattered like pieces of a puzzle no one has ever been able to finish. The scene at Somerton Beach. The first police officers who arrived at the scene noted how unusual the body looked. His clothing, a crisp suit, tie, and polished shoes, despite the fact that it was a warm summer evening the night before. His posture, as though carefully arranged, with no sign of struggle or injury. His belongings, no wallet, no identification, not even a hat, a strange omission for the time. One peculiarity, the labels had been cut from all of his clothing. Witnesses later recalled seeing a man matching his description the previous night, lying in the same spot. Some thought he was drunk, others assumed he was asleep. No one approached him. By morning, he was gone. The autopsy. The body was taken to the Royal Adelaide Hospital, where an autopsy was conducted. The findings only deepened the mystery. His organs showed signs of congestion, particularly the liver and spleen, suggesting poisoning. His stomach contained remnants of a pasty, meat pie-like meal. No traces of poison were found in his system. The coroner concluded that poisoning was the likely cause of death, perhaps from a rare, untraceable substance like digitalis, but no proof could be established. His body bore no injuries. His fingerprints matched no records. His teeth did not correspond with dental charts in Australia. He was quite simply unidentifiable. The first leads. Investigators scoured train stations and hotels across Adelaide, looking for a trace of the mystery man. Days later, a breakthrough. At the Adelaide railway station, an unclaimed suitcase was discovered in a cloakroom. Inside were several items of clothing, all with their labels removed, just like the clothing on his body. Among the contents were a stenciling brush, a knife, and a thread of unusual orange waxed yarn, rare in Australia but common in the United States. This suggested he might not have been local. But again, no identification. The paper scrap. Months later, during a second examination of his possessions, investigators found a small scrap of paper rolled tightly and hidden in a pocket of his pants. The paper bore 2 words, Tamam Shud. These words were Persian, meaning "it is finished" or "the end." They came from a collection of poems known as the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The discovery electrified the case. Was it a suicide note, a cryptic message, a signal? Police appealed to the public, and soon a man came forward with a copy of the Rubaiyat. It had been found tossed into the backseat of his car, parked near Somerton Beach. In its final page, a portion had been torn out, the exact portion that contained the words Tamam Shud. This book contained more clues. On the inside cover, investigators found a string of letters that resembled a code. Below it, a phone number. The woman named Justin. The phone number led police to a nurse named Jo Thompson, known in records as Jessica, but to her friends as Justin. She lived in a nearby suburb and, when questioned, seemed deeply unsettled by the case. She admitted that she had once given a copy of the Rubaiyat to a man she knew named Alfred Boxall. Police tracked down Boxall, alive and well in Sydney, still in possession of the book she had given him. When shown the bust of the Somerton man, Thompson reportedly turned pale and nearly fainted, but she insisted she did not know him. Her reaction, however, has fueled speculation ever since. Theories begin to grow. By now, the case was becoming more than just a local curiosity. It was a Cold War mystery. In 1948, the world was tense, divided between East and West. Adelaide housed a military research facility not far from Somerton Beach. Was the Somerton man a spy? Was he poisoned with a substance so advanced it left no trace? Was the coded message in the Rubaiyat linked to intelligence work? Others offered simpler explanations. He was a jilted lover, some said, taking his own life near the home of a woman he could not have. Or perhaps he was a migrant, poor and alone, who simply collapsed and whose origins could not be traced. But none of these theories fully explain the strange constellation of facts: the missing labels, the cryptic book, the untraceable poison. The burial. With no identification and no family stepping forward, the Somerton man was buried in June 1949 at West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide. His grave, marked with the inscription, "Here lies the unknown man found at Somerton Beach," remains a site of quiet fascination. Flowers would occasionally appear at the grave, left by unknown hands. Some claimed they were left by Justin. Others said they were left by intelligence officers paying their respects to a fallen comrade. The case did not close. It simply slipped into the realm of enduring mysteries. And so we end the first section of this story with the question: who was the Somerton man, and why did his final message read simply, "It is finished"? We left off with a grave mystery, a dead man with no name, a scrap of Persian poetry in his pocket, and a woman who seemed to know more than she dared to admit. The Somerton man case had already captured the imagination of Adelaide, but what came next elevated it into the realm of legend, codes, spies, and theories that stretched across continents. The mysterious code. The copy of the Rubaiyat found in a man's car near Somerton Beach contained more than just the missing Tamam Shud scrap. On its inside back cover, faint indentations revealed a strange sequence of letters. WRGOABABD, MLAUI, WTBIMPNTP, MLIABOIQC, IDTMTSMSTJB. At first glance, it looked like nonsense, but to investigators, it hinted at something deeper: a cipher. The Australian police consulted naval intelligence and even reached out internationally. Codebreakers from Britain and the United States examined the letters. The consensus. The writing bore the hallmarks of an incomplete or abbreviated code, perhaps a one-time pad used in espionage. But without the key, it could not be deciphered. Theories exploded. Some claimed it was a mnemonic for a poem. Others thought it was a spy's dead drop signal. To this day, the sequence has never been cracked conclusively. Cold War shadows. The timing of the Somerton man's death cannot be ignored. It was 1948, barely 3 years after World War II, and the Cold War was already tightening its grip on the globe. Australia, though geographically remote, was deeply enmeshed in intelligence networks. Just outside Adelaide stood the Woomera Test Range, a top-secret facility where Britain and Australia collaborated on missile research. Soviet spies had already been detected attempting to infiltrate similar projects. Could the Somerton man have been a spy, an operative caught in a dangerous game of intelligence, silenced with a poison that left no trace? The idea was not far-fetched. In fact, Declassified files later revealed Soviet espionage activity in Australia during that very period, often operating under seemingly ordinary covers. The role of Jestin. But espionage was not the only theory. The case's most enigmatic figure remained Jo Jestin Thompson, the nurse whose number was written in the rubaiyat. She lived only a short walk from where the body was found. When shown the bust of the Somerton man, her reaction was one of shock too visceral, many believed to be that of a stranger. Some speculated she had known him intimately, perhaps during the war. She had worked as a nurse, tending to soldiers, and may have encountered him as a patient. Others whispered of a darker possibility, that she had been involved in espionage herself, providing information to Soviet contacts. There was never any evidence to prove it, but her secrecy only fueled the fire. She refused to discuss the case with family and remained evasive until her death in 2007. The suitcase puzzle. The unclaimed suitcase at Adelaide railway station provided tantalizing but incomplete answers. Tools of trade. Stenciling brushes suggested the man may have worked in shipping or military stenciling. Odd details. One tie bore an unusual stitch, not common in Australian tailoring but seen in American clothing. Global hints. The orange waxed thread inside the suitcase matched thread used to repair the Somerton man's trousers, yet the thread was unavailable in Australia. Taken together, the suitcase painted a picture of a man who was not local, who may have traveled widely, and who had deliberately removed identifying labels from his belongings. But why remove the labels unless he intended to vanish without a trace? The flowers at the grave. Years after the burial, the Somerton man's grave continued to draw mystery. Fresh flowers appeared without explanation. Some speculated they were left by Jestin. Others thought they might have come from fellow operatives, marking the passing of a comrade. Police never determined who placed them there. The simple act of leaving flowers transformed the unknown man into something larger, a symbol of secrets carried to the grave. Speculation and conspiracies. By the 1950s, newspapers worldwide picked up the story. Each retelling added new layers of intrigue. The lover's tale. Some believed the Somerton man had been romantically involved with Jestin, fathering her child, and had come to Adelaide to see her. Rejected, he may have taken his own life with poison. The spy theory. Others believed he was a foreign operative, silenced before he could pass on critical information or after he had betrayed his cause. The migrant theory. A more mundane explanation suggested he was a displaced person from Europe, one of many who migrated after the war, living under an assumed identity. The absence of proof for any theory kept the case alive. A child with striking features. One of the most controversial threads emerged decades later. Jestin had a son, Robin, born in 1947, just a year before the Somerton man's death. Robin grew up to have distinctive physical traits, notably a rare dental anomaly, hypodontia, and an unusual shape to the upper ear. When forensic experts compared photographs of Robin to the plaster bust of the Somerton man, the similarities were striking. Could Robin have been the Somerton man's son? If true, it would explain Jestin's secrecy and her visible shock when confronted with the man's likeness. But without DNA evidence, it remained only speculation. The case goes cold. Despite years of investigation, the case eventually ran aground. No one could identify the man. No poison was detected. The code remained unsolved. Jestin refused to cooperate further. By the mid-1950s, official interest waned. The Somerton man was left as an enduring enigma, an unsolved puzzle at the intersection of love, espionage, and tragedy. But the mystery refused to die. Cliffhanger. In the decades that followed, new technologies, DNA testing, genetic genealogy, Digital forensics would reopen the case and bring investigators closer than ever to unraveling the truth. And so the question hangs in the air. Would modern science finally reveal the identity of the Somerton man, or would the mystery only deepen with time? By the time half a century had passed, the Somerton man had become more than a mystery. He was a legend. His story was retold in crime anthologies, spy thrillers, and late-night radio shows. For many Australians, he was a ghost haunting Somerton Beach, a reminder of secrets left unsaid. But for investigators, professional and amateur alike, the case was never closed. Advances in science promised answers that had eluded the original detectives in 1948. The plaster bust. One reason the Somerton man's story endured was the bust. Shortly after his death, a full plaster cast of his head and upper torso had been made before his burial. This bust became the touchstone for the case. For decades, it sat in police storage, a silent witness. Journalists and researchers studied it, comparing its features to missing persons, to photographs of soldiers, even to known spies. Each comparison raised hopes, but none were definitive. And yet the bust held a power. Those who saw it described the face as both ordinary and extraordinary handsome, composed, enigmatic. It was as if the cast itself carried the unanswered questions of the case. Renewed interest in the 2000s. By the early 2000s, the case was being revisited by a new generation of researchers. University professors, forensic pathologists, and hobbyist codebreakers all turned their attention to the mystery. One of the most vocal was Professor Derek Abbott of the University of Adelaide. He became fascinated not just with the case itself, but with the possibility of identifying the Somerton man through modern forensic science. Abbott noted the peculiar ear shape and dental anomalies, and he became convinced that these features connected the man to Justin's family line. But speculation could only go so far. DNA was needed. Exhumation and DNA analysis. For years, requests to exhume the body were denied. Officials argued that disturbing a grave without clear public benefit was unwarranted. But as DNA technology improved, and as the case gained public attention, the South Australian government finally granted permission. In May 2021, after more than 70 years, the Somerton man's body was exhumed from West Terrace Cemetery. Scientists hoped to recover usable genetic material from his remains. The work was delicate. Decades of burial had degraded much of the biological evidence. Yet, through advanced techniques, fragments of DNA were extracted. Genealogical sleuthing. The DNA was analyzed using the same methods that had solved the Golden State Killer case in the United States, forensic genetic genealogy. By comparing the Somerton man's DNA to genealogical databases, researchers built family trees, tracing connections back through distant relatives. It was a painstaking process, but by 2022, Abbott and his team announced they had a likely identification. Carl Charles Webb, a Melbourne-born electrical engineer and instrument maker, born in 1905. Webb had been estranged from his family, with little record of his later life. Crucially, no death record existed for him. His disappearance around the late 1940s aligned with the Somerton man's discovery. Who was Carl Webb? The identification was groundbreaking, but it raised almost as many questions as it answered. Carl Webb was not a spy, at least not in any official record. He was not a known criminal. He had trained as an engineer, married, but his marriage reportedly fell apart. He seemed to vanish from public records around the same time the Somerton man appeared. Some researchers speculated that Webb, facing personal turmoil, might have taken his own life. The presence of the Rubaiyat, with its themes of fate and finality, could support this. Others argued that Webb's skills as an engineer could still have linked him to sensitive military work, especially given Adelaide's proximity to weapons research sites. His death, they suggested, could still have involved espionage or betrayal. Loose ends and lingering mysteries. Even with Webb's name, gaps remain. The cause of death remains uncertain. No conclusive evidence of poison has ever been found. The code in the Rubaiyat has not been solved. If Webb wrote it, its meaning died with him. The connection to Jestin is unresolved. Was she truly a stranger, or did she conceal a personal link out of shame or fear? The flowers on the grave remain unexplained. Who placed them and why? The answers may never be known. Webb's life ended in obscurity, and the story that followed elevated him into myth. The broader impact. What makes the Somerton Man case so compelling isn't just the unanswered questions. It's the way it embodies the tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary. A man in a suit dead on a beach could be anyone. Yet the details, the cut labels, the cryptic book, the Cold War context transform him into a riddle. The case illustrates how fragile identity is. Strip away papers, names, and connections, and even a man in the middle of a modern city can become an enigma. It also demonstrates how far forensic science has come. Where once investigators relied on fingerprints and dental charts, today they can reach into the grave and reconstruct ancestry through strands of DNA. Reflection. As you picture Somerton Beach, the waves rolling in on a December morning, think of the man in the suit resting against the seawall. For decades he was nameless, a cipher himself. Now perhaps he has a name, Carl Webb, yet the mystery is not gone. Because even with identity, the central question remains. Why did he die there alone with a message in his pocket that read only, "It is finished"? Story 3. The Great Emu Oil Swindle. At first glance, it sounds almost comical. Emu oil, a product rendered from the fat of Australia's largest bird, sold in little bottles and marketed with miraculous claims. But behind the absurdity lies a crime story of ambition, deception, and the exploitation of trust. The so-called Great Emu Oil Swindle is not a single event, but a collection of scams, lawsuits, and dubious medical claims that unfolded in Australia and abroad through the 20th century, at times destroying fortunes and leaving behind victims who believed they had found a cure-all. This story is not about murder, espionage, or grand heists. It is about the quiet crimes of fraud, the kind that slip past unnoticed until the damage is done. And like all great crime stories, it reveals not only the flaws of the fraudsters but the vulnerabilities of those they targeted. What is emu oil? The emu is a flightless bird, native to Australia, second only to the ostrich in size. For Aboriginal Australians, the emu has been a source of food, clothing, and medicine for thousands of years. Traditional practices included using rendered fat as a salve for wounds, burns, and joint pain. In the late 20th century, as natural remedies gained popularity, emu oil was rediscovered by entrepreneurs who saw in it not just a folk remedy, but a potential gold mine. By the 1980s and 1990s, emu oil was being marketed worldwide as an anti-inflammatory, moisturizer, and even a treatment for arthritis and heart disease. The problem was simple. While emu oil does have some moisturizing and anti-inflammatory properties, scientific studies did not support the grandiose claims made by sellers. Yet the marketing machine roared ahead. The birth of the swindle. In rural Australia, small emu farms began popping up, promising investors high returns from emu meat, leather, and oil. Glossy brochures promised profits rivaling those of cattle or sheep farming. Investors were told that demand for emu oil in the health and cosmetics industries would make fortunes overnight. The truth was very different. Many emu farms were pyramid-like schemes. Farmers paid exorbitant prices for breeding pairs, under the promise that they could resell the offspring to other new farmers. The actual market for emu products was far smaller than advertised, and emu meat tough and gamey never caught on widely. By the mid-1990s, hundreds of Australian investors realized they had been swindled. The promised emu boom collapsed into lawsuits, bankruptcies, and abandoned farms littered with giant birds no one knew how to manage. Miracle in a bottle. But the scam didn't end on the farms. Bottled emu oil became the centerpiece of a global health product fraud. In the United States especially, companies marketed it as a miracle cure. Advertisements claimed it could erase wrinkles and scars, heal burns overnight, cure arthritis, high cholesterol, even cancer. Celebrities endorsed it. Late-night infomercials praised it. Multi-level marketing companies used emu oil as their star product, urging recruits to sell it to friends and family. The profits were enormous, but so were the deceptions. Victims of hope. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the emu oil swindle was its human cost. Arthritis sufferers spent thousands of dollars on tiny vials of oil, hoping for relief that never came. Parents of sick children rubbed it into their skin, believing it would cure ailments that required real medical treatment. Cancer patients, desperate for alternatives, were persuaded to abandon proven therapies for a bottle of bird fat. In interviews and depositions, some of these victims later described their sense of betrayal. They had not only lost money, they had lost time, health, and trust. Government investigations. As complaints mounted, government agencies began to investigate. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, issued warnings to emu oil companies for making unproven medical claims. In Australia, consumer protection agencies cracked down on misleading advertisements and fraudulent emu farm investment schemes. Lawsuits proliferated. Investors sued farm operators. Customers sued marketers. Class action suits targeted the largest emu oil distributors. And yet, despite fines and sanctions, the industry never fully disappeared. The promise of natural miracle cures was too seductive, and the claims too difficult to stamp out completely. A symbol of a larger problem. The great emu oil swindle is more than a quirky footnote in crime history. It reflects a recurring pattern. Fraud thrives where hope meets science's gray areas. Just as snake oil salesmen once peddled miracle tonics from wagons, emu oil entrepreneurs exploited the hunger for cures and the trust placed in natural remedies. The fraud worked because it blended just enough truth with falsehood. Emu oil does have moisturizing and anti-inflammatory qualities, but the leap from soothes dry skin to cures cancer was a chasm filled by marketing, not evidence. The unfinished question. By the early 2000s, many of the worst offenders had been shut down, and the emu boom had collapsed. Yet emu oil products can still be found today in health stores and online, marketed with the same vague promises of wellness. When we left off, the first cracks were appearing in the glossy facade of the emu oil industry. Investors were realizing that their golden birds were not delivering golden profits. Consumers were discovering that miracle cures came in bottles filled with empty promises. But the unraveling of the great emu oil swindle was not a simple collapse. It was a tangled story of lawsuits, hidden networks, and regulators chasing shadows. The rise of the emu boom. To understand how the swindle gained such momentum, you need to picture rural Australia in the 1980s and early 1990s. Farming communities were struggling. Droughts and economic downturns made traditional livestock less profitable. Into this uncertainty came the promise of emus, a supposedly low-maintenance animal that would yield meat, leather, and oil with minimal input. Entrepreneurs claimed that emus would be the next global agricultural revolution. Their meat was healthier than beef, their leather softer than cowhide, their oil worth more than gold. Breeding pairs were sold for staggering sums, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, on the assurance that new farmers could resell offspring at even higher prices. It was the classic structure of a speculative bubble, profits not based on real demand, but on the constant influx of new investors. Cracks in the facade. By the mid-1990s, the bubble began to burst. Market collapse. Consumers were not buying emu meat in significant quantities. Restaurants rarely featured it, and supermarkets barely stocked it. Oversupply. Thousands of emus flooded the market, but buyers disappeared. Breeding pairs that once sold for $20,000 now fetched barely $1,000 if they sold at all. Investor panic. With no genuine product demand, investors realized they had been sold inflated promises. Abandoned emu farms became a bizarre sight across Australia and the US, where the craze had spread. Farmers who once dreamed of riches now faced the cost of feeding giant birds no one wanted. The miracle oil industry. If the farms were collapsing, the oil industry kept the illusion alive. Companies shifted focus, pushing emu oil as the core product. Marketing campaigns exploded, particularly in the United States. One company, operating out of Texas, promised emu oil could penetrate the skin deeper than any other substance. Others claimed it cured baldness, reversed arthritis, or improved heart health. Regulators grew alarmed. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission, FTC, and the FDA issued warnings, citing fraudulent medical claims. But the marketers were clever. They shifted their wording, replacing cures with supports wellness or promotes health, carefully threading the needle of legality. The profits were immense. Even when fines were issued, the companies often paid them off as the cost of doing business. Investigative exposés. Journalists played a crucial role in exposing the fraud. In the mid-1990s, several investigative programs in Australia and the U.S. aired undercover segments. Reporters filmed emu oil salesmen making outrageous promises to elderly arthritis sufferers. Others revealed the pyramid structure of emu farm investments, where profits came only from selling birds to new recruits rather than from real consumer demand. These exposés embarrassed regulators, forcing them to act. Class action lawsuits followed, targeting emu oil distributors who had defrauded investors and consumers. Some companies were bankrupted, others rebranded, only to continue the same practices under different names. The role of multi-level marketing. Perhaps the most insidious development was the adoption of emu oil by multi-level marketing, MLM companies. These organizations recruited everyday people, often stay-at-home parents, retirees, or financially struggling individuals to sell emu oil to their personal networks. Recruits bought starter kits, attended seminars filled with motivational speeches, and were encouraged to rope in friends and family. The structure mirrored the emu farm investment scheme. Profits flowed to those at the top, while the majority at the bottom lost money. For some families, the losses were devastating. Not only did they sink savings into unsellable products, but they also strained relationships with loved ones pressured into buying miracle oil. Regulators fight back. By the late 1990s, governments in both Australia and the US had begun cracking down. In Australia, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission (ACCC) pursued fraudulent emu farm promoters. Courts ruled that many had misled investors, awarding damages to victims. In the US, the FDA issued warning letters and seized shipments of emu oil marketed as medicine. Several companies were fined or shut down for violating health product regulations. Yet enforcement had limits. Fraudsters moved quickly, setting up new companies as soon as old ones were closed. Others simply shifted marketing online, beyond the easy reach of regulators. The human toll. The most haunting part of the emu oil swindle lies not in the court rulings or financial losses, but in the stories of individuals. Elderly arthritis sufferers described spending their pensions on bottles of oil that did nothing to relieve their pain. Farmers were left with fields full of unwanted emus, forced to cull birds when they could no longer afford to feed them. Families fractured over MLM schemes, where trust was twisted into profit. Fraud thrives in hope, and hope was what these victims had clung to. A broader pattern. Looking at the great emu oil swindle, one sees echoes of other frauds. Tulip mania in 17th century Holland, snake oil tonics in 19th century America, and cryptocurrency bubbles in the 21st century. The product changes, but the pattern remains. Exaggerated promises, inflated markets, desperate investors, and inevitable collapse. Cliffhanger. By the early 2000s, regulators had shut down some of the worst offenders, and the emu boom had fizzled. But the story wasn't over. Emu oil remained on store shelves, still marketed with vague health claims. And fraudsters learned from the collapse, shifting tactics for the new millennium. So the unresolved question remains. If regulators exposed the fraud and the emu boom collapsed, why does emu oil still survive today? And what does that persistence reveal about our willingness to believe in miracle cures? By the dawn of the 21st century, the emu oil boom had left behind a trail of wreckage, failed farms, empty wallets, and disillusioned consumers. What began as a promise of prosperity and miraculous cures had unraveled into one of the more bizarre fraud stories in modern history. But unlike a cleanly solved crime, the legacy of the great emu oil swindle lingers, not just in court documents and bankruptcies, but in the lessons it offers about human hope, trust, and deception. The collapse of the emu farming dream. By the late 1990s, the Australian emu farming industry had imploded. Breeding pairs that once sold for $20,000 were now worth less than a few $100s. Farmers, unable to resell offspring at inflated prices, found themselves stuck with hundreds of birds. The costs were staggering. Emus require vast amounts of feed and space. Without a viable consumer market for emu meat or leather, farmers hemorrhaged money. Some resorted to mass culling, their fields littered with the remnants of a failed promise. Many investors sued the promoters who had sold them on visions of wealth. Courts found that some farm operators had knowingly misrepresented the market, inflating demand and fabricating forecasts. Damages were awarded, but most victims never recovered their losses. The collapse was a textbook speculative bubble, money flowing not from real consumer demand, but from new investors propping up a market destined to collapse under its own weight. The persistence of the oil. Even as the farming side collapsed, emu oil products refused to vanish. In health food stores, pharmacies, and online marketplaces, little bottles of 100% pure emu oil continued to sell. Marketers became more careful, avoiding explicit claims like cures arthritis, and instead using phrases such as promotes joint comfort or supports skin health. This linguistic shift was deliberate. Regulators could not penalize vague wellness claims in the same way they had cracked down on false medical promises. Fraud gave way to pseudoscience, carefully couched in marketing language. And for many consumers, the allure remained. Testimonials filled advertising brochures. My pain vanished overnight. My wrinkles disappeared. Such anecdotes, though scientifically meaningless, held emotional power. Regulators in retreat. Government agencies continued to monitor emu oil marketers, but resources were limited. The collapse of the industry had already scattered many perpetrators. Those who remained operated in smaller, fragmented businesses, harder to police. In the U.S., the FDA occasionally issued warning letters, but enforcement dwindled. In Australia, consumer protection agencies prioritized larger, more urgent cases. The fraud hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone quiet, blending into the vast landscape of alternative health products. Victims remember. For those who had invested or believed, the wounds lingered. Farmers spoke bitterly of losing everything: their savings, their land, their dignity. Some said the emu boom destroyed entire communities, leaving behind distrust of get-rich-quick schemes. Arthritis sufferers and cancer patients who had spent hundreds or thousands on emu oil treatments spoke of betrayal. One elderly woman told an interviewer, "I didn't just lose money. I lost years I could have spent on real medicine." Families fractured over multi-level marketing. Siblings and friends stopped speaking to one another, resentments festering over failed investments and broken trust. Fraud, unlike theft, leaves wounds that run deeper than the financial. It corrodes relationships and faith in institutions. A broader lesson: the Great Emu Oil Swindle is a case study in the psychology of fraud. It shows how criminals exploit three universal vulnerabilities. Hope: people will cling to anything that promises relief from suffering or a path to prosperity. Trust in nature: natural is often equated with safe and effective. Fraudsters use this association to sell oil as superior to modern medicine. Fear of missing out: farmers and investors were told they would be left behind if they didn't enter the booming emu market. The pressure to act quickly prevented rational decision-making. These vulnerabilities are not unique to emu oil. They appear in every fraud, from miracle diets to cryptocurrency scams. The product changes, but the psychology does not. The legacy of emu oil. Today, emu oil remains available worldwide. Scientific studies confirm it has moisturizing properties and some potential anti-inflammatory effects. But it is not a miracle cure. The extraordinary claims that fueled the swindle have never been proven. And yet people still buy it. Some swear by it. The persistence of emu oil reflects a broader truth. Once a product enters the realm of belief, evidence matters little. Fraud becomes folklore, sustained by testimonials and word of mouth long after regulators have moved on. Reflection: the Great Emu Oil Swindle is not just about birds or bottles of oil. It is about the ways we deceive ourselves. Fraudsters thrive because they understand that people want to believe in easy cures, quick profits, and simple solutions. When you think of this case, imagine the sight of empty emu farms in rural Australia, their fences rusting, their fields overgrown. Picture the small glass bottles on pharmacy shelves, still promising comfort. And remember the people who bought into the dream, only to discover it was built on sand. If hope itself can be sold, how can we ever protect ourselves from the next swindle that promises salvation in a bottle? Story 4. The Wine Fraud of Ruddy Kurniawan. Wine is supposed to be about pleasure: an old vineyard, a rare vintage, a bottle that carries history in its glass. For collectors, wine is not just a drink but an investment, a symbol of sophistication and wealth. But in the early 2000s, one man exploited that passion with such cunning that he fooled the most seasoned connoisseurs in the world. His name was Ruddy Kurniawan, and his scheme became the most notorious case of wine fraud in modern history. This story is not about violence or murder, but about deception on a grand scale, about how greed, arrogance, and desire blinded billionaires, collectors, and auction houses alike. The rise of Ruddy. Ruddy Kurniawan arrived in the United States from Indonesia in the 1990s. To those who met him, he was charming, soft-spoken, and always eager to please. He carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who belonged in the world of wealth, even if his background was clouded in mystery. By the early 2000s, Ruddy had embedded himself in the exclusive circle of wine collectors. He spent lavishly at auctions, sometimes dropping millions of dollars in a single evening. He hosted dinners where he opened legendary bottles, Burgundies and Bordeaux, thought to be nearly impossible to find. Collectors, dazzled by his generosity, embraced him as one of their own. But behind the charm and generosity, Ruddy was already building his empire of deception. The allure of rare wine. To understand Ruddy's scheme, you need to understand the culture of fine wine collecting. Scarcity. Some vintages are produced in such small quantities that only a handful of bottles survive. Their rarity makes them highly valuable. Status. Owning a bottle of Chateau Lafite Rothschild or Domaine de la Romanée Conti is a badge of prestige. Subjectivity. Unlike gold or diamonds, wine cannot be easily verified. Its authenticity depends on taste, labels, and provenance, all of which can be manipulated. In this world, where a single bottle can fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars, the line between passion and obsession blurs, and Ruddy knew how to walk that line. The birth of a forger. In a quiet kitchen in his Los Angeles home, Ruddy began his craft. Using a collection of cheaper wines, he blended them with remarkable skill to mimic the taste of rare vintages. He carefully aged bottles, steamed off labels, and replaced corks. His operation was not crude, it was meticulous, almost artistic. Friends later recalled seeing stacks of bottles, corks, and labels in his home. He was not just forging wine, he was manufacturing an illusion. And it worked. Collectors tasted his blends and swore they were drinking history. Auction houses, dazzled by the prices his bottles fetched, rarely asked questions. Record-breaking auctions. In 2006, Ruddy consigned hundreds of bottles to a major auction in New York. The sale was extraordinary, bringing in more than $10 million. Some bottles fetched record prices, their provenance vouched for by Ruddy's reputation as a discerning collector. But whispers began to circulate. Some bottles listed were of vintages that experts knew had never been produced. Others bore labels with subtle errors, fonts, logos, or designs that did not exist at the time. The cracks in Ruddy's empire were beginning to show. The billionaire's suspicion. One of the first to openly challenge Ruddy was Bill Koch, a billionaire energy magnate and wine collector. Koch had already been burned once before, having purchased bottles supposedly owned by Thomas Jefferson that later proved to be forgeries. When he examined bottles he had purchased through Ruddy, he noticed discrepancies, labels too pristine for their age, glass that didn't match historical styles. Koch launched his own investigation, hiring former FBI agents to scrutinize every detail. The findings were damning. Dozens of Ruddy's bottles were fake, cobbled together from cheaper wines and dressed up as priceless treasures. The community divided. Yet even as suspicions mounted, Ruddy maintained supporters. Many collectors, unwilling to admit they had been duped, defended him. To question Ruddy's wines was to question the very foundations of the fine wine market, a market built as much on trust and reputation as on authenticity. Auction houses, too, were reluctant to act. Ruddy was a star consignor, and his bottles brought prestige and profits. To turn against him was to risk their own credibility. But the evidence could not be ignored forever. The FBI steps in. By 2008, the FBI had begun to investigate Ruddy. Agents monitored his purchases, tracked his auctions, and eventually raided his Los Angeles home. What they found was astonishing. Stacks of counterfeit labels, printing equipment, and hundreds of bottles in various stages of forgery. The glamorous image of Ruddy as a connoisseur collapsed overnight. He was not a tastemaker. He was a counterfeiter on a scale the wine world had never seen. Cliffhanger. Yet the most pressing question remained. How had Ruddy managed to fool so many for so long? And when the truth came out in court, what would it reveal about the billionaires, auction houses, and collectors who had been so eager to believe in him? We left off with Ruddy's glamorous world collapsing under the weight of suspicion and FBI scrutiny. What had seemed like generosity and refined taste was now exposed as fraud on a staggering scale. But the truth of how deep his deception ran and how he was able to deceive the world's most powerful collectors would only come to light through painstaking investigation and a courtroom drama that shook the wine world to its core. The FBI raid. On March 8, 2012, federal agents arrived at Ruddy Kurniawan's Los Angeles mansion. What they found inside was not a home, but a counterfeiting laboratory. Hundreds of bottles sat in various stages of completion, some empty, some filled with blended wines, others labeled and corked as if ready for auction. Stacks of labels for the world's most coveted vintages lay in drawers and cabinets. Some were painstakingly aged with tea or oven-baked to mimic decades of wear. Corking and bottling equipment stood in the kitchen, transforming an ordinary suburban home into the hub of a multi-million-dollar fraud. It was quite literally a factory of lies. The scale of the fraud. Experts estimated that Ruddy may have sold thousands of counterfeit bottles during his reign. His blends fooled collectors who prided themselves on their refined palates. His fakes infiltrated the cellars of billionaires, royalty, and auction houses. The sheer audacity was staggering. Ruddy had passed off wines from vintages that never existed, such as Domaine Ponsat bottles allegedly from the 1940s, decades before the estate even began producing them. The question wasn't whether Ruddy had committed fraud. The question was, how had he gotten away with it for so long? The wine world complicit. Part of the answer lies in the culture of fine wine itself. Collectors often preferred belief over skepticism. To admit a bottle was fake was to admit vulnerability, to confess that one's judgment, or worse, one's status, had been fooled. Auction houses, too, had little incentive to dig deeply. Ruddy's consignments drew global attention and record-breaking bids. By authenticating his bottles, they authenticated themselves. The market thrived on trust, and Ruddy exploited that trust perfectly. Some critics later argued that Ruddy's fraud succeeded not despite the wine world's sophistication, but because of its arrogance. Collectors wanted to believe in legends, and Ruddy provided them. The trial. Ruddy was charged with mail fraud and wire fraud. His trial began in 2013 in New York City. For the first time, the glamorous facade of rare wine collecting was placed under the harsh light of a criminal courtroom. Prosecutors laid out the evidence. Fake labels seized from his home. Testimony from experts who confirmed entire vintages he sold had never existed. Financial records showing millions of dollars in fraudulent sales. Collectors like Bill Koch testified about being defrauded, not only financially but reputationally. For men who prided themselves on their expertise, admitting they had been duped was humiliating but necessary for justice. Ruddy's defense painted him as a scapegoat, suggesting that others in the wine world had also participated in fraud and that Ruddy was being singled out. But the evidence was overwhelming. The verdict. In December 2013, Ruddy Kurniawan was convicted of fraud. He was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed under the charges. The judge described him as someone who had not only defrauded wealthy collectors but undermined trust in the entire fine wine market. It was the first time in U.S. history that a person was convicted of wine fraud on such a scale. The aftermath. The fallout was immense. Collectors reeled. Some sellers worth millions were suddenly suspect. Owners quietly pulled bottles, fearing embarrassment if their wines were exposed as Ruddy's fakes. Auction houses faced scrutiny. How had they authenticated Ruddy's bottles? Were they negligent or complicit? Lawsuits flew in multiple directions. The wine world reformed. Greater emphasis was placed on provenance, record-keeping, and scientific testing. Ultraviolet scans, glass analysis, and forensic cork inspections became part of the authentication process. But the damage was already done. Some experts estimate that hundreds, if not thousands, of Ruddy's bottles remain in circulation today, silently resting in prestigious cellars, their owners either unaware or unwilling to confront the truth. Ruddy behind bars. In prison, Ruddy maintained a low profile. Unlike flamboyant fraudsters who relish attention, he largely faded into obscurity. Yet his case remained a cautionary tale, proof that even in the most exclusive corners of wealth and sophistication, fraud can flourish when greed and ego override skepticism. Cliffhanger. And yet, one question lingered. Was Ruddy merely a gifted forger acting alone, or was he part of a larger network of counterfeiters, one that continues to flood the market with fake wines to this very day? By the time Ruddy Kurniawan's trial ended in 2013, he had already transformed the world of fine wine forever. His fraud was not just about counterfeit bottles. It was about how easily desire, greed, and arrogance can blind even the most sophisticated experts. To conclude his story, we need to look at what happened after his conviction, how his actions reshaped the market, and why his shadow still lingers in cellars around the world. Ruddy's sentencing. When the judge handed down a 10-year prison sentence, he made it clear this was about more than punishing one man. Ruddy had changed the way we think about wine, the judge said, not in celebration but in warning. Wealthy collectors who prided themselves on discernment had been exposed as vulnerable. Auction houses had been embarrassed, and the broader public had been reminded that fraud does not only target the poor or gullible, it thrives wherever trust is blind. Ruddy was also ordered to pay more than $28 million in restitution to victims. But in the world of billionaires, money was almost secondary. The greater loss was reputational. How could one boast of a wine collection when there was a chance the crown jewel was brewed in Ruddy Lowe's Angel's Kitchen? The lingering bottles. Perhaps the most chilling legacy of Ruddy's fraud is that thousands of his bottles remain unaccounted for. Experts estimate he sold or circulated as many as 10,000 counterfeits during his peak years. Some were confiscated and destroyed, but many others were purchased, consumed, or quietly stored away. In some cases, collectors refused to test their bottles, preferring ignorance over the humiliation of admitting they had been deceived. This means that even today, a counterfeit Ruddy creation could be opened at a billionaire's dinner party, toasted as a rare treasure, and swallowed without anyone realizing the truth. The auction house's reckoning. The case forced auction houses into a period of reckoning. Sotheby's and Christie, the most prestigious auction houses, implemented stricter authentication processes, including forensic testing of labels, glass, and corks. Smaller houses were forced to adopt similar standards or risk collapse. Buyers demanded guarantees, and lawsuits loomed for those who failed. Some auctioneers defended themselves by claiming Ruddy had fooled everyone, but critics argued they had turned a blind eye to obvious inconsistencies, dazzled by the profits his bottles generated. In this sense, Ruddy did not just exploit the system, he revealed its weaknesses, forcing reforms that may never have happened otherwise. The collector's humiliation. The billionaires and moguls who bought Ruddy's wines often avoided public comment, but their embarrassment was clear. Men who prided themselves on their refined palates had been duped by blends of cheap wine. Those who had spent millions could no longer flaunt their collections without suspicion. Bill Koch, one of Ruddy's most vocal accusers, summed it up bluntly. "He didn't just cheat me out of money, he made me look like a fool." For many collectors, this was the deepest cut. Wine, after all, is not only about taste but about identity. To be deceived was to have that identity punctured. Ruddy's release. After serving about 7 years of his 10-year sentence, Ruddy was released from prison in 2020 and deported to Indonesia. His re-entry into public life was quiet, but rumors immediately began to swirl. Was he living comfortably off hidden wealth? Would he attempt to re-enter the wine trade under another identity? So far, no evidence suggests Ruddy has returned to counterfeiting, but his name still carries weight in the wine world. whispered with both anger and fascination. A broader problem. Ruddy's case was the first major wine fraud conviction in the U.S., but it was not the last. His exposure prompted deeper investigations into counterfeit wine worldwide. Experts discovered that counterfeit bottles were rampant, particularly in Asian markets where demand for rare French vintages surged. Entire industries of forgery, from recorking operations to label printing businesses, were uncovered. Ruddy had been the most flamboyant, but he was far from alone. Some estimate that as much as 20% of rare wine on the market today could be counterfeit. Ruddy's crime, far from an anomaly, was a symptom of a much larger disease. The legacy of deception. The legacy of Ruddy Kurniawan can be summed up in 3 lessons. Expertise is not infallible. Even the most experienced collectors and sommeliers can be deceived when ego and desire cloud judgment. Systems thrive on trust, and trust can be exploited. The fine wine world operated on reputation and handshakes. Ruddy exposed the fragility of that model. Fraud never truly disappears. Even after convictions and reforms, counterfeit bottles circulate, carrying the ghost of Ruddy's work into the present. Reflection. Picture it, a dimly lit cellar in Bordeaux or Hong Kong, lined with rare vintages worth millions. A guest selects a bottle, uncorks it, and pours a glass. The aroma is rich, the taste complex, the prestige undeniable. But somewhere in that cellar, perhaps in many, lies a bottle that never touched the soil of Burgundy or Bordeaux. It was born in a Lowe's Angel's kitchen, poured from a cheap blend and dressed up in lies. Ruddy's crime was not only in making that bottle, but in reminding us of an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the value we assign to objects is nothing more than the stories we tell ourselves about them. If legends in a bottle can be fabricated so easily, how many other luxuries, paintings, jewels, even histories are simply deceptions we have chosen to believe? Story 5. The Vanishing of the Springfield Three. On the morning of June 7, 1992, in the quiet city of Springfield, Missouri, 3 women vanished without a trace. Their names were Cheryl Levitt, her daughter Susie Streeter, and Susie's friend Stacy McCall. The case, now known as the disappearance of the Springfield Three, remains one of the most haunting mysteries in American crime history. There were no signs of forced entry. No screams were heard in the night. Their cars, personal belongings, and even their cigarettes were left behind. It was as if they had simply evaporated into thin air. More than 3 decades later, the case remains open, a source of both local legend and quiet dread. To this day, investigators, family members, and amateur sleuths continue to ask, what happened inside that small house on East Delmer Street? The night before, Susie Streeter and Stacy McCall were both 18 years old, recent high school graduates celebrating their freedom. On June 6, 1992, they attended several graduation parties around town. The night was filled with laughter, photographs, and the bittersweet excitement of leaving childhood behind. Their plan was to spend the night at a friend's house, but the house became too crowded. Instead, they decided to return to Susie's home on East Delmer Street, where she lived with her mother, Cheryl. It was just after 2 a.m. when they arrived. From that moment on, no one outside the house ever saw them again. The discovery. The following day, when friends and family couldn't reach them, people began arriving at the Delmer Street home. What they found was unsettling. Cars, all 3 women's vehicles were parked outside, suggesting they hadn't left voluntarily. Belongings, purses, keys, and cigarettes sat untouched inside. Susie's dog, a small Yorkshire Terrier, was frantic but unharmed. House condition. The beds appeared to have been slept in, but nothing was out of place. No broken windows, no blood, no clear sign of struggle. A broken porch light. The glass globe around the front light had been shattered, though investigators could not determine if it was related to the disappearance. Friends who entered the home described a strange, eerie calm, as if the women had been there just moments earlier. The immediate investigation. Police were called, but from the start, the case suffered setbacks. The home had already been entered by multiple people before investigators arrived, contaminating potential evidence. Fingerprints were smudged and objects had been moved. Despite this, investigators pursued several lines of inquiry. Runaway theory. At first, some wondered if the women had simply decided to leave, but their cars, money, and personal items suggested otherwise. Abduction. Others believed they had been taken in the night, perhaps lured by someone they knew. The lack of forced entry supported this. Multiple perpetrators. Given the challenge of abducting 3 women at once, police considered the possibility of more than one suspect. From the outset, the disappearance looked less like a random event and more like a carefully orchestrated crime. Suspects and leads. Over the years, several suspects have been named, but none conclusively linked. Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and suspected murderer. Cox lived in Springfield at the time. He was interviewed and later imprisoned for unrelated crimes. He gave conflicting statements, sometimes claiming knowledge of the women's fate, sometimes denying involvement. Chester Franklin, another local man, was investigated after making strange comments, but no evidence tied him to the case. Multiple perpetrators theory. Some investigators suspected the women may have been lured out of the house by someone they trusted and then abducted together. Despite extensive questioning, no suspect has ever been charged. Theories abound. The disappearance of the Springfield 3 spawned a multitude of theories. Home invasion. Someone entered the house in the night, perhaps through the unlocked front door, and abducted them silently. Trusted visitor. The women may have opened the door willingly, only to be overpowered. Burial site rumors. Years later, tips claimed the bodies had been buried in concrete at a local hospital construction site. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies, but authorities declined to dig, citing insufficient evidence. Serial connection. Some wondered if the crime was linked to other disappearances in the region, though no clear connection has ever been proven. Each theory raised more questions than answers, and none brought closure. The family's grief. For the families, the disappearance was a torment without end. Without bodies, there could be no funerals, no finality. Susie's brother and Stacy's parents campaigned tirelessly for answers, but leads ran cold. The case became a constant presence in Springfield. Billboards, flyers, and vigils kept their names alive. Yet the silence from East Delmer Street remained. Reflection. Imagine a quiet suburban home, the kind you might walk past without a second thought. Now imagine stepping inside to find life suspended. Purses on the counter, cars in the driveway, a dog packing nervously. No struggle, no sign of violence, just absence. That was the scene at the Levitt home on June 7, 1992. When 3 women vanish from their own home, the search begins with urgency. But as hours stretched into days and days into years, the disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, her daughter Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall turned into something far stranger than a missing persons case. It became a riddle that investigators could never quite solve, and one that the town of Springfield could never forget. The first 48 hours. Police knew the first 2 days were critical. Missing persons cases often hinge on evidence gathered immediately, but here, that evidence had already been compromised. Friends and family had entered the house, tidied up glass from the broken porch light, and even answered the phone when it rang. Those calls themselves became eerie. Several people reported obscene prank calls coming to the Levitt home in the days immediately after the women disappeared. Was it coincidence, a cruel prank by strangers, or a chilling taunt from someone involved? Investigators could never confirm. Witness statements. In the first wave of questioning, police canvassed neighbors and partygoers from the night before. Some claimed to have seen Susie and Stacy leaving the graduation party. Others remembered them mentioning plans to go swimming the next day. One witness reported seeing a green van parked near the Levitt home early that morning. The lead sparked hope. Perhaps the women had been forced into the van, but no such vehicle was ever found, and the sighting remained unverified. Every detail seemed to point somewhere, yet nowhere. Suspect in Vogus. Several individuals drew investigators' attention over the years. Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and suspected murderer. He lived in Springfield at the time, and later, while imprisoned in Texas, claimed he knew the women were dead. But his shifting stories and lack of concrete evidence made him unreliable. Some believed he sought attention, others feared he really did know. Two local men tied to car thefts. Susie Streeter had testified against them in a case weeks earlier. Could her disappearance have been retaliation? Police considered it but found no physical link between the men and the crime scene. Unnamed acquaintances. Rumors swirled of people from the girls' social circles, but none produced a solid lead. Each suspect brought a burst of media attention and hope, but the case always circled back to the same silence. Theories that refused to die. 1. The hospital concrete theory. One of the most enduring rumors came years later. A tip suggested the bodies had been buried beneath a parking garage at Cox Hospital in Springfield, under construction at the time of the disappearance. Ground-penetrating radar showed 3 anomalies consistent with graves, yet officials refused excavation, citing cost, disruption, and lack of direct evidence. For families desperate for answers, the refusal was devastating. 2. The serial predator theory. Some investigators wondered if the Springfield Three were victims of a transient predator, someone passing through who struck by chance. Springfield sits along major interstate highways, a crossroads for truckers and travelers. The theory fit, but it left no trail to follow. 3. A trusted visitor. The lack of forced entry made many believe the women had let someone in. Was it a friend, a neighbor, someone they knew well enough to open the door for at 2 a.m.? If so, that person never came forward. Media and public obsession. The case quickly transcended Springfield. National programs like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries featured the disappearance, each time generating a wave of new tips. Psychics contacted police with visions. Amateur sleuths flooded detectives with theories. But attention cuts both ways. Leads became tangled in rumor, overwhelming investigators. The sheer volume of calls, letters, and sightings often drowned out credible information. Family torment. For the families, the years were brutal. Stacy McCall's parents became tireless advocates, working with law enforcement, appearing on media programs, and organizing awareness campaigns. Susie's brother fought to keep his sister and mother's names alive in the public eye. But hope became a burden. Every phone call carried the possibility of news, yet almost always ended in disappointment. The absence of answers, the inability to grieve properly, left scars deeper than any crime scene. The Cold Case Unit. In later years, Springfield police established a dedicated cold case unit to re-examine evidence. Advances in forensic technology, particularly DNA analysis, offered new possibilities. Investigators retested items from the home, though contamination from the earliest hours limited what could be learned. Detectives continued to interview suspects and revisit tips, but without a crime scene, a body, or a confession, every lead felt like chasing shadows. Why the case endures. Part of why the Springfield Three case remains so haunting is its ordinariness. This was not a dark alley or a dangerous city. It was a small, safe neighborhood. A mother and daughter, a best friend, a quiet home, and then nothing. The lack of violence at the scene only deepens the mystery. In most crimes, there are traces: blood, broken doors, signs of struggle. Here, the absence of evidence feels almost deliberate, as if someone had planned every detail to erase their presence. Cliffhanger. By the 2000s, the case had become a kind of ghost story for Springfield, a reminder of how easily people can vanish. Yet investigators refused to give up. Rumors of buried bodies, confessions behind bars, and strange tips kept the case alive, each new lead raising the same painful question: will the truth of what happened to the Springfield Three ever be uncovered, or is it destined to remain buried forever? For more than 3 decades, the disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall has remained an open wound in Springfield, Missouri. Despite thousands of tips, national media coverage, and relentless investigation, the truth continues to elude those who search for it. To close their story here, we'll look at how the case has evolved in recent years, the lingering theories, and the deep impact it has left on a community, and on the very way we think about missing persons cases. Advances in forensics. As technology advanced, investigators returned again and again to the evidence collected in 1992. Unfortunately, the contamination of the crime scene in the first critical hours limited what could be tested. Still, modern DNA methods offered hope. Household items such as clothing, hairbrushes, and cigarette butts were re-examined, though none produced new suspects. Anonymous letters sent in the years after the disappearance were tested for DNA, but yielded no matches in CODIS, the national database. Ground-penetrating radar (GPR) was used at the Cox Hospital parking garage in 2007, detecting suspicious anomalies beneath the concrete. But without strong evidence, authorities refused to dig, fearing a costly false lead. Each effort kept the case alive, but yielded no breakthroughs. Theories revisited. 1. The retaliation theory. Some investigators still suspect the car theft case that Susie testified in shortly before her disappearance. Could someone connected to that case have targeted her and, by extension, her mother and friend? While plausible, no forensic evidence has tied any of the men involved to the crime. 2. The serial predator theory. Others lean toward the idea of a stranger or transient criminal, perhaps a trucker passing through Springfield's crossroads of interstates. This theory explains the complete disappearance. Someone could have quickly transported the women out of state. Yet it leaves open the question of how 3 people were subdued without resistance or evidence. 3. The trusted visitor. The lack of forced entry suggests the women may have let someone involuntarily. A trusted acquaintance could have walked through the door, turning a late-night visit into abduction. But no one ever confessed, and no one has ever been charged. The prison confessions. Over the years, inmates in Missouri and beyond have claimed knowledge of the Springfield Three. Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper, has repeatedly suggested he knows the women are dead. He once claimed their bodies would never be found, but Cox has offered no details and refused to name accomplices. Authorities regard him with suspicion, unsure whether he is a genuine suspect or simply seeking notoriety. Other convicts have floated stories of involvement, but each time, details proved false or unverifiable. These so-called confessions brought surges of attention, but little real progress. The community's long vigil. Springfield has not forgotten. For decades, candlelight vigils have been held in memory of the missing women. Billboards and posters continue to bear their faces, even as the photographs age. The house on East Delmer Street became a kind of local shrine, its normal suburban appearance masking its place in one of America's great unsolved mysteries. Eventually, it was sold, renovated, and reoccupied. But for many locals, passing by still triggers a chill. The case is part of Springfield's identity, now an unsolved scar that shapes how the community understands safety and vulnerability. The human cost. For the families, the pain of ambiguity is immeasurable. Without bodies, there can be no closure. Without closure, grief cannot settle. Stacy McCall's parents have campaigned tirelessly, working with organizations to improve missing persons protocols. Susie's surviving brother has described the torment of not knowing whether his mother and sister are dead, alive, or suffering somewhere unknown. Time has passed, but the ache remains fresh. Every year without answers is another year stolen. Why the case endures? Part of the Springfield Three's hold on the public imagination lies in its perfect storm of elements. Ordinariness. A mother and two young women in a quiet neighborhood, gone in an instant. Absence of evidence. No forced entry, no struggle, no bodies. Multiplicity. 3 people vanished together, making it unlikely they simply left voluntarily. Longevity. 3 decades later, the mystery has not weakened, it has deepened. The case is studied in criminology classes and discussed in true crime forums worldwide. It is often compared to other infamous vanishings, like the Beaumont children in Australia or the Sodder children in West Virginia cases where families were left with only questions. Reflection. As we close this story, imagine again the scene. A warm June night, a small house on East Delmer Street. Inside, 3 women fall asleep after a night of celebration. Outside, the neighborhood is silent. By morning, the house remains, but the women are gone, leaving behind only their cars, their purses, and an absence so complete it feels almost supernatural. In the end, the disappearance of the Springfield Three forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, crimes leave no answers. Sometimes, the most haunting stories are not the ones that end in revelation, but the ones that never end at all. If 3 women can vanish from their own home in the middle of a city without a sound or a trace, how safe can anyone truly feel? Story 6. The Curse of the Great Brinks Robbery. On a frigid night in January 1950, Boston's North End witnessed one of the most daring robberies in American history. Armed men, disguised and disciplined, broke into the Brinks armored car depot and escaped with more than $2.7 million in cash and securities, over $30 million in today's money. For years, the heist was hailed as the crime of the century. But what makes the Great Brinks robbery so fascinating isn't only the precision of the theft. It's what happened afterward: betrayals, paranoia, and a curse-like unraveling that seemed to haunt every man who touched the stolen fortune. The Brinks Company. In post-war Boston, Brinks was synonymous with security. Their armored trucks carried cash for banks, payrolls for factories, and securities for businesses. Their depot on Prince Street in the North End was supposed to be impenetrable, equipped with multiple locked doors, time delay safes, and watchful guards. But to a group of professional criminals, Brinks represented not security, but opportunity. The conspirators. The heist was the brainchild of Joseph "Big Joe" Maginnis, a seasoned gangster who assembled a crew of fellow criminals. Among them were Anthony Pino, Stanley "Gus" Gussera, and several others who had reputations in burglary and armed robbery. For more than a year, the crew studied Brinks. They observed guards, routines, delivery schedules, and security weaknesses. Using copied keys, they practiced breaking in after hours, carefully timing their movements. This was no smash-and-grab job. It was meticulous, almost militaristic. The night of the heist. On January 17, 1950, just after 7 p.m., the crew made their move. Masks and uniforms. Dressed in navy coats and chauffeur caps, their rubber masks made them look eerily alike. Entry. Using their duplicate keys, they entered through a side door, catching employees by surprise. Execution. In less than 30 minutes, they bound the guards with tape, filled bags with cash and securities, and vanished into the night. The haul was staggering: $1.2 million in cash and $1.5 million in checks, money orders, and securities. It was the largest robbery in U.S. history at the time. Panic and public frenzy. The next morning, Boston was buzzing. Headlines screamed of the crime of the century. The FBI and local police flooded the North End. Politicians demanded answers. How could such a fortress-like facility be breached so easily? For Brinks, the robbery was humiliating. For the public, it was thrilling. The idea that ordinary men had outsmarted a major security company captured imaginations nationwide. But for the robbers, the job was only half finished. The real challenge lay ahead, holding onto the money without getting caught. The investigation. The FBI launched one of the largest investigations in its history. Surveillance. Agents staked out known criminals, bugged phones, and tapped informants. Community pressure. In Boston's North End, a tight-knit Italian-American community, rumors circulated about who might be involved. Forensic evidence. At the scene, investigators found almost nothing, only a few strips of tape and a chauffeur's cap. Despite enormous pressure, the investigation stalled. The Brinks robbers had vanished into the shadows. Tensions in the crew. Meanwhile, inside the gang, unity began to fray. Splitting the money was one thing, keeping it hidden was another. Some members buried cash in backyards. Others hid it in attics or stashed it with relatives. But paranoia gnawed at them. They couldn't spend too freely without drawing suspicion. And time was not on their side. The statute of limitations for robbery was 6 years. If they could avoid arrest until January 1956, they would be legally untouchable. The curse begins. It was during these years of hiding that the so-called curse of the Brinks job began to reveal itself. Members grew mistrustful, watching each other for signs of betrayal. Some turned reckless, spending money in ways that drew attention. One member, Gus Gussira, was eventually caught on an unrelated charge, and investigators began pressing him for information. The crew had pulled off the perfect heist, but could they survive the aftermath? Cliffhanger. By 1953, the Great Brinks robbery had faded from headlines, but the FBI never stopped hunting. As the statute of limitations ticked down, the pressure mounted. Inside the crew, fear and greed boiled over. Would they all make it to freedom together, or would betrayal crack the perfect crime wide open? When the Brinks crew slipped into the night on January 17, 1950, with $2.7 million, it looked like they had pulled off the impossible. The newspapers called it the crime of the century. The FBI, embarrassed and desperate for leads, launched one of the largest manhunts in its history. And yet, for a time, the robbers appeared untouchable. But a heist is never truly over until the money is spent or until someone talks. And as the years ticked toward the statute of limitations, the Brinks gang discovered that keeping quiet was harder than breaking into the vault. The FBI's relentless hunt. J. Edgar Hoover, then director of the FBI, was furious. A robbery of this scale was a direct challenge to federal authority. Hoover poured resources into the case. Surveillance. Known criminals in Boston's North End were watched day and night. Wiretaps. The FBI bugged phones and monitored conversations, hoping someone would slip. Pressure on families. Relatives of suspected gang members were questioned, intimidated, and scrutinized. Despite the intensity, the investigation stalled. The robbers had left almost no physical evidence, just a cap and some tape, and none of the crew talked. Living with the money. Meanwhile, the gang faced their own torment. How to live with millions of dollars without drawing suspicion. Paranoia. Most of the money was hidden in safe houses, attics, and backyards. Spending it too freely could bring attention. Temptation. Some couldn't resist. Small splurges, a new car here, a flashy suit there, caught the FBI's eye. Division. Arguments erupted over how much each man had taken, and whether the money was being spent too quickly. The cash that had once seemed like liberation now felt like a trap. The weak links. Every crew has its weak spots, and in the Brinks case, two members cracked under pressure. Stanley "Gus" Gussira was arrested on an unrelated burglary. In prison, agents leaned on him for information. Though he never fully confessed, his arrest planted seeds of doubt in the gang. Could Gus be pressured into betraying them? Joseph "Specs" O'Keefe, a burglar and safecracker, became the real danger. After being jailed on weapons charges, O'Keefe grew increasingly bitter. He felt shortchanged in the money split and paranoid that others were plotting to kill him to keep him quiet. O'Keefe's anger simmered into something the FBI could exploit. Betrayal. By 1954, O'Keefe had reached his breaking point. From prison, he wrote letters begging for help, complaining about the unfair split. Some crew members tried to placate him with cash. Others began plotting his murder. The paranoia turned violent. Hitmen were sent to silence O'Keefe. In one attempt, a gunman opened fire on him with a machine gun, but O'Keefe survived. Bleeding and enraged, he realized his only way out was to turn on the gang. And so, the perfect crime began to unravel. The confession. Facing both death threats and the FBI's pressure, O'Keefe broke. He gave investigators the names of his fellow conspirators, the planning details, and the aftermath. His testimony, backed by smaller pieces of evidence, finally gave the FBI the breakthrough it had sought for years. On January 12, 1956, just 5 days before the statute of limitations expired, the FBI arrested most of the Brinks crew. The timing was dramatic. Had O'Keefe stayed silent just one more week, the men would have been beyond legal reach. The trials. The trials were sensational. Newspapers relished the story. The meticulous planning, the years of silence, the final betrayal. O'Keefe testified against his former partners in exchange for leniency. The others, furious, called him a traitor. The courtroom became a theater of bitterness, greed, and paranoia. In the end, most of the surviving crew received life sentences. Justice, at least formally, had been served. The missing money. But the conviction didn't end the mystery. Of the $2.7 million stolen, only about $58,000 was ever recovered. The rest simply vanished. Where did it go? Some believed it had been hidden in secret caches, never found. Others thought family members of the robbers quietly spent it over the years. A more haunting theory suggested some of the crew may have buried their shares, intending to retrieve them after release only to die in prison or take the secret to their graves. The unrecovered fortune remains one of the most tantalizing elements of the case. The curse of the Brinks robbery. The curse of the Brinks job refers to how badly life turned out for nearly every man involved. Several died in prison, their millions lost to time. Others lived paranoid lives, hunted not only by the FBI but by their own partners. Even O'Keefe, whose betrayal secured his freedom, never truly enjoyed peace. He lived under constant threat, a marked man for the rest of his days. The robbery that had once promised riches instead brought misery, fear, and death. Cliffhanger. By the late 1950s, the case was technically closed, but the missing millions and the haunting fates of the robbers kept the story alive. Was the Brinks fortune truly lost forever, or does some part of it still lie hidden in Boston's soil, waiting for discovery? By 1956, the Brinks crew had gone from the architects of the perfect crime to prisoners serving life sentences. The FBI claimed victory, the public devoured every detail, and Boston slowly returned to normalcy. But the legend of the robbery was far from over. What lingered was not just the spectacle of the heist, but the strange misfortune, the curse, that seemed to follow everyone touched by the stolen fortune. The fate of the robbers. After the dramatic arrests and trials, the men behind the heist faced decades behind bars. Joseph "Big Joe" Maginnis, the alleged mastermind, died in prison, never revealing where his share of the money went. Anthony Pino, meticulous planner, also served a life sentence before dying in obscurity. Stanley Gus Gussira, caught on unrelated charges, died relatively young, his portion of the fortune lost with him. Vincent Costa, Henry Baker, and Michael Geegan, lesser-known members, faded into the prison system, their lives defined by the heist that had once promised glory. Joseph Specs O'Keefe, the betrayer whose testimony doomed the others, lived the rest of his life under threat. He never found peace, even with the FBI's protection. In each case, the money that had seemed like salvation became poison, drawing suspicion, betrayal, and ultimately despair. The vanished millions. The greatest mystery of the Brinks robbery remains the missing money. Of the $2.7 million taken, only about $58,000 was recovered. The rest simply disappeared. Where did it go? Hidden caches. Some investigators believe much of the money was buried or walled up in secret hiding places around Boston. If so, those caches may still lie undiscovered. Family dispersal. Others suspect family members quietly spent small portions over decades, laundering it through legitimate businesses. Lost forever. A more haunting idea suggests large amounts were lost outright, destroyed, misplaced, or buried in places known only to men who died in prison. Treasure hunters in Boston have searched for years, but no confirmed stash has ever been found. The unrecovered millions turned the Brinks robbery into a modern treasure legend, fueling rumors and folklore. The curse explained. Why call it a curse? Because in hindsight, nearly every man involved was undone not by the FBI, but by the money itself. Paranoia. The fear of betrayal consumed the gang, leading them to attempt murder on their own member, O'Keefe. Greed. Arguments over the split sewed division that weakened their unity. Silence. Had they trusted one another, they might have reached the statute of limitations, but distrust tore them apart. The robbery, which seemed to demonstrate perfect criminal discipline, in fact revealed the fragility of alliances built on greed. Cultural impact. The Brinks robbery captivated the public for decades. Media coverage. Newspapers followed every twist, painting the robbers as both villains and anti-heroes. Books and films. The heist inspired true crime books, documentaries, and even fictionalized movies that glamorized the gang. Boston's memory. In the North End, the robbery became part of local lore, whispered about in bars and retold to new generations. In many ways, the Brinks robbery shaped the template for the modern heist story. Meticulous planning, flawless execution, but eventual collapse through betrayal. Lessons learned. Law enforcement also changed. The FBI used the Brinks case to emphasize persistence and surveillance, showing that even the most carefully planned crime could unravel with time. Banks and armored car companies upgraded security, focusing on insider risks and duplicate keys, the very weaknesses exploited by the gang. For criminologists, the case became a textbook example of why conspiracies fail. The more people involved, the greater the chance of betrayal. Reflection. Standing in Boston's North End today, it's easy to forget the Prince Street Depot where the Brinks job unfolded. The building is gone, the neighborhood changed, yet the echoes remain. Somewhere, perhaps, bricks of 1950s cash still lie hidden in a cellar or beneath city soil. The curse of the Brinks robbery is not supernatural. It is the inevitable fate of greed. The fortune that should have secured the robbers' futures instead destroyed them, leaving behind prison cells, betrayals, and unanswered questions. What is more haunting? The thought of millions lost forever in Boston's earth, or the reminder that even the perfect crime cannot escape the flaws of the men who commit it.